In our previous segments on Romans, I've talked about the intimate connection between sin and worship. That from Romans 1, from Romans 12, we see this progression. Beginning with sin, or beginning with worship, it will determine the shape and the condition of our heart and mind, which will determine the direction and condition of all aspects of our life. I want to illustrate this where I think Paul models the sort of perspective on the self that comes out of having the heart and mind correctly oriented in worship to God. Now, most of us are going to be familiar with Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, because these are such core verses in so many Bible memory programs. A verse we're probably not as familiar with is what immediately follows in Romans chapter 12, verse 3. And I want to focus on just one little statement Paul makes here, and I think what it betrays about Paul's understanding of himself and also Paul's understanding of ministry. And I want to bring this into a session like this simply because I know the people that watch these things at Seedbed are often people who are in ministry or people who sense some kind of call on their life, that God has called me in one way or the other to some form of service, whatever that may be. And I think this speaks not only to the people in Rome, I think it speaks to us, to anybody who's called into ministry or service of any form or any kind. Now, Paul says this. He says, "By the grace given to me, I say to you." And I think that one little statement embodies a correct balance on ministry that comes from an orientation of a life to worship and honoring God, and that flows out of a renewed heart and a renewed mind. I find the two mistakes that most people run into, the dangers we have to avoid in ministry, is one, thinking more highly of ourselves than we ought, to borrow Paul's language here, or thinking too little. And maybe sometimes the greatest danger is thinking too little. But Paul navigates these two dangers quite well here. You know, Paul is not afraid when the time comes about to say, "I'm an apostle." That's a pretty big claim. But he says it because he understands, as he says here, that he's an apostle by the grace given to him. For Paul to say he's an apostle isn't to say, "I'm an apostle." For Paul to say he's an apostle is to say, God called me by His grace, and God empowers me by His grace. For Paul to say he's an apostle is to make a statement more about God than it is about him. So Paul doesn't think more highly of himself than he ought. He understands that he speaks solely by the grace of God. Now, the second danger, and the one I think that often gets overlooked, is that we think too little of ourselves. So it isn't that maybe we're the person that's in danger because we're such a charismatic speaker or whatever, gifted in certain ways with speaking or upfront leadership, that we draw attention to ourselves. That's not a danger for us to think or become arrogant or filled with ourselves. Our danger is we think so little of ourselves that we don't speak. Now, Paul would have good reason to think that. I mean, given his background as a persecutor of the church and so on, all these things we know about Paul from Acts and from Paul's own letters. He had good reason to think quite little of himself. But he still says, "By the grace given to me, I say to you." Even with all of Paul's background and problems and so on, Paul still speaks because, again, he knows that his calling is what he's speaking is not from himself, it's from God. So he has the courage to say, for all the things I could say, I ought to shut up. For all the self-doubts I may have about who, me to do this? Who, me to speak? Paul still has the courage to say, I say to you. So there's a very careful balance that misses the two ditches we can fall into in any kind of not just Christian ministry, and we think of professional ministry, but the kind of service God calls all of His people to, of a life devoted to Him and in service of others and so on. We don't think more highly of ourselves than we ought. We also don't think too lowly of ourselves than we ought. With Paul, we can say, by the grace given to me, I say to you. We don't speak too strongly, but we also don't fail to speak either, because we know it's God that's behind what we do, God who's called us to do what we do, and God who will be responsible for bringing fruit out of what we do and what we speak as well.